Good afternoon. Happy Friday. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon to have a chat about your key selection criteria responses. So it's wonderful to have quite a few of you in a session today at the end of a long day, end of a long week. It's really nice to be able to come together and go through some information. Hopefully there'll be some bits and pieces that you'll take away from this session to be able to make your key selection criteria responses even better, because of course we are sort of getting to that point of the year where a lot of jobs will start to be advertised for 2021. So I just want to, if nothing else, help you to feel a little bit more confident and comfortable with the idea of putting your responses together to help inform your applications when you're at that stage. So just give it a minute or so. I'd say there's a few additional attendees still coming in. While we're waiting to get started, if you're new to this system, I will point out there is a section called questions. So this is an area where you can write questions throughout the session, or we will have some time at the end of the session to address some questions that you might have. So whether you want to hold off until we've sort of gone through the content and then you can ask away. We will also be working through a few different case studies. Some lovely educators have been really proactive and have put their hand up to have their key selection criteria responses be looked at today and workshopped a little bit. So I'll be also prompting some suggestions along those examples about how maybe the responses could be improved upon. So I'd really love your thoughts around that as well, because of course, I'm not the only one in this session. You're all here with me and I'm not the expert at all. I'm just here to share my insight based on my experience and also the schools and their advice that we're partnered with. So just to get started, I'll introduce myself, that might help. My name is Beth and I am a senior education consultant with ANZUK Education. I currently support schools and educators in the inner western suburbs as part of the West team. I've also been fortunate enough to be involved in a lot of resource writing for ANZUK over the 2.5 years that I've been with the company. And prior to that, I was a drama and English teacher in secondary. So that's my background. It's lovely to have you all here. And now that we've got quite a few attendees watching this session, we will move on to a bit of an introduction about what we're going to be going through today. So to start things off, we'll be going through, well, what is the key selection criteria? What's the purpose of it? That might help to get things started. We'll also be deconstructing the current key selection criteria for government primary and government secondary teaching positions. Of course, when it comes to the key selection criteria, Catholic schools will have their own set, independent schools can each have their own set, and also education support staff roles will have different criteria. So there's quite a few different areas, and unfortunately we don't have the opportunity to cover them all today. But the most common ones that we do look at are for primary and secondary, and there's sort of crossover within those. So we'll deconstruct the ones for 2020. I'll also be going through some insight that we've received from some of our schools, just around general advice about what people in leadership and on that application panel are looking for in key selection criteria responses, just to give you a bit of insight on their side of things. We'll also be going through some things to consider with your responses to prepare your writing, and then some different approaches you could have to your writing. And then I mentioned at the start of the session, we've had some great educators that have volunteered to have an excerpt of their key selection criteria response included, so we can have a little bit of a look at that. And after some of the writing advice and the feedback from schools and taking all of that into consideration, we can actually work towards maybe working through and sort of troubleshooting some things with those case studies to see how those pieces could be improved upon. So if you are just coming into the session now, as I mentioned right at the start, I am really keen for you to engage with me throughout this session. So what you'll see is there is a section that's called questions, and that's an area where you can type in if you have questions, but also you can write comments. So throughout, if you've got some ideas or suggestions, particularly when it comes to the case study section, feel free to pop something in there. Well, what we're going to do just to get started, I'm really interested in knowing who's joining me today. So I'm going to be releasing a poll that I'd love for you to fill out, really just trying to understand what brings you to this session today. What's your current situation? Are you a pre-service teacher just about to graduate, and this is the first time you've looked at key selection criteria? Are you a casual relief teacher looking for a contract position and again, sort of new to the process or a bit unsure about how to involve your experience in your key selection criteria from a CRT's perspective? Are you an experienced teacher who's been in a role for a while that's looking for something new for next year but hasn't had to look at key selection criteria for a long time? Or are you here for a different reason? So I'm just going to launch the poll now. So I'd love to see your responses. If you are unable to, sometimes when I do these webinars, I think it depends on your browser or how you're viewing this webinar. If you're not able to do the poll, you can write your answer in that questions section that I mentioned. Most of the time people are able to at least contribute to that. I'm sorry if the poll doesn't work on all platforms or all browsers. But I am seeing, yeah, the numbers are climbing. Wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for your responses. I'll just give it a little bit more time so everyone gets a chance to look at the poll. So a lot of people are casual relief teachers, about 50%. We've got 25% pre-service teachers, about 12% experienced teachers, looking again at new role opportunities for next year. And I've had a couple of people add to the question section as well. We've got some graduates from education support certificates and also, yeah, another person that's casual relief looking for a contract. So a lovely mix of you today. Hopefully the advice that we go through will have some application to your situation and what you're looking to achieve for next year. So thank you so much, everyone, for contributing your answers. We'll just close the poll now. So the first thing I'd love to go through today is really, what's the point? Why do we have key selection criteria? So when you are applying for positions, there's really three key components to that application process. So first of all, you'll be putting together a CV that will have an outline of your experience, a real overview of your experience and skill set that you might also add with a cover letter as the starting point or the front-facing aspect of your application. And then you've got your key selection criteria, which you also submit. Again, if you're looking on Recruitment Online, for example, that's something you'll submit alongside your CV when you go through that process. And then, of course, if a school looks at you and they love you by the looks of your CV and your key selection criteria response, you can sort of escalate everything again to your interviewing stage and, of course, still pull from information from your CV and key selection criteria. But we really sort of look at the key selection criteria as quite a substantial part of the application process. So it's an extension of your CV, really. So where your CV might have a brief outline, dot points, things like that, your key selection criteria is a really good opportunity for you to give context to some of your experience, expand it, show your personality, really walk schools through some situations you've been in, successes that you've had, even challenges or new things that you want to learn. It really enables them to sort of walk through and get a sense of who you are as a person and as a teacher. So really it's a space where you are invited to reflect on your experience thus far. So as a pre-service teacher, that can be through your placement experience, or if you've had prior experience working with students, don't just think it has to be classroom based. It's really an area where you can reflect on things, identify maybe particular initiatives that you've been involved with, programs, to try and involve some unique experience in addition to sort of the day-to-day duties of a teacher or a teaching assistant. But also part of the purpose of the key selection criteria is to provide an equitable process. So when you're looking on Recruitment Online, you'll see there's a standard process. So everyone's pressing the same button when it says apply. Everyone's following the same criteria, and even school to school, government schools will have the same criteria. And it's really just to be able to assess everybody accurately and equitably. So there will be slightly different criteria if you compared a government primary role to a government secondary one, to a government education support or admin role. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the Catholic network will have their own. And then even one independent school to the next can have their own. So it's really worth making sure that you're sort of reading through them properly. You'll probably notice there's some common themes about things that you'll get asked to comment on. But for the purposes of our time together today, I am just going to be focusing on those government positions that you'll notice through Recruitment Online. Government schools have to advertise upon Recruitment Online, so there's even more of a focus on equity. So that's what you'll come up against most often, whereas independent schools can kind of make their own rules to a point. Just before we move forward, I have seen a couple of questions about sharing of the PowerPoint. There's actually going to be a survey at the end of this session where if you would like to have access to this PowerPoint after the session, you can just answer yes, and then I will have, from your registration into this session, I will have your email address. So I'll then be able to use that to invite you so that you can come back to these slides later on. So just to ease your mind, you don't have to take notes of all the slides. They'll be available if you would like them. So I'm just going to move into a bit of a breakdown of the key selection criteria that are in place for 2020. So what you will notice year on year, if you are an experienced teacher or you've been checking these things out maybe across the course of your studies as a pre-service teacher, the wording and the topic areas does vary slightly. So it is really important when you're applying for jobs that you make sure that the key selection criteria you're responding to are current. So what you will notice first off is that all schools will have 5 key selection criteria standard that they must follow. But some schools will actually include a 6th or even 7th sometimes key selection criteria response. So that's just worth keeping in mind when you're working school to school, or if you're trying to use the same document for each application that you're doing. It's just worth keeping in mind. So at the moment for primary, so key selection criteria 1 speaks about the incorporation of literacy and numeracy, responding to student needs, knowledge of relevant curriculum. The second point is around high impact teaching strategies, how these are implemented to guide student learning and student growth. The third one is about really assessment focus and the use of data to inform future teaching. Then we've got interpersonal and communication skills. So that's across students, parents, colleagues, the broader community, ultimately to support student learning, wellbeing and engagement. And then the 5th one is just around the department values. As you'll notice there, I've included a couple of key selection criteria 6. So this was just through me looking through Recruitment Online and picking out a couple of schools that had included a 6th one. So these aren't standard ones by any means. These are just some examples. So one school had included the ability to develop, implement and evaluate a remote learning program. Very relevant for right now. And then another one had asked to speak about the 21st century learning approaches to grow a cohort, or the needs of a growing school. So the school that had included this one is a very new school. So I was really looking towards, have you been involved in a growing community or worked towards sort of longer term targets when it comes to supporting a school community? So those are 2 extra ones. And then for our secondary teachers, here are the ones you'll already notice that there's some similarities. So the first one again talks about curriculum, literacy and numeracy across the curriculum. The second one, high impact teaching strategies. The third one is about assessment. Fourth one again about wellbeing, and then the department values. So very, very similar. You might notice that there's some things that might be switched around in the phrasing, or there might be a bit of a different order. Still important to read through them though when you go to do them each time. And again, here are some examples of a 6th one that's been included by a few government secondary schools that I found. So the first one talks about the structure and programs offered at school name. So this one, the school's asking you to invest some time in learning about that particular school and discussing your understanding of their programs and maybe how your prior experience can align with that. And then this, the second optional one is basically just around personal attributes, which I thought was really interesting. So commenting about collaboration, perseverance, if you're an improvement focused person, how you encourage inclusivity, so enabling all students to engage in your learning practices. So that's a really interesting one that I hadn't seen before. So I thought it would be interesting to include that one. So those are your secondaries. So I thought an extension of that, I might pull apart one a little bit further for you for primary, because I think one of the things that can be really intimidating when you first go to do your key selection criteria responses, for one thing, you're sort of looking at a blank page, so it can all feel like a lot. But then even if you're sitting down and reading the key selection criteria, there's so many different parts to it. And I know that the worry can be, am I supposed to talk about all of these things in one example? How am I supposed to do that? Or sometimes even reading it and trying to interpret the whole thing can be really hard. But really, you don't necessarily have to comment about every single part in just one example. You might opt to do, there might be something that really jumps out to you in part of the criterion that you just want to focus on for all of your examples, or maybe you spend a few different examples of your experience drawing on different parts. So if we were to use this criterion for primary as an example, I've highlighted some keywords. This is a good starting point as well. If you're just sitting down and you're looking at the criterion and trying to understand them, doing the old highlighter, embolding, underlining can be a good way to pull out some keywords that can help your brainstorming from there. So with this one, you're being asked to talk about high impact teaching strategies. So those are setting goals, structuring lessons, explicit teaching, worked examples, collaborative learning, multiple exposures, questioning, feedback, metacognitive strategies, and differentiated teaching. So a lot there. So you might start by picking one of those things or two of those things to talk through from a planning perspective, but then you could also talk about implementing, because it asks about planning and it asks about implementing. So you might focus more so on implementation and impact. You might want to focus on discussing in this example how you came to understand your group of students, so how they learn best from a type of learner. Maybe you're in a classroom where there's students at lots of different levels and how you differentiated or accommodated that, or even learner behaviour. So you might focus on engagement, for example, or learning needs. And then finally, the keyword at the end is around student learning growth. So you might want to focus on if you've worked with a cohort of students, or just maybe have a few different examples of more incidental snapshot moments of student growth, like little eureka light bulb moments from an academic, social, and emotional perspective. So that is breaking down an example, and it might help to do that even as a brainstorming starting point, as I said, doing those keywords and then thinking through, if I was to just focus on one part of this criterion, what are some things that I could talk about, just so it all feels a little bit more compartmentalized, so it's a little bit less daunting to do. I've pulled apart one for secondary as well, for my secondary teachers. So this one is demonstrated attitudes and behaviours, switch that around, behaviours and attitudes consistent with department values, demonstrated experience in reflecting upon practice and engaging in professional learning to continually improve the quality of teaching. So again, if we're going and doing the highlighting, you might choose to select and discuss the individual department values, which are responsiveness, integrity, impartiality, accountability, respect, leadership, and human rights. You might choose to use this criterion to discuss how you've reflected upon your teaching practice, so the way that you reflect and why you think it's beneficial to reflect on your teaching practice in such a way. Discussion of professional learning that you've previously undertaken, why you've chosen to do that, and then looking again, especially for our pre-service teachers, professional learning you'd like to undertake in future. And then discussion of the ways you've then applied professional learning to your practice. How has it improved the quality of your teaching? If you're in more of a leadership position or you've mentored others, led a department, etc., this could actually be extended for how you've used professional learning to mentor others, or how you've implemented professional learning strategies as part of a team. So there's lots to draw from that example as well. So with, of course, the work that we do, we're very closely connected with our partner schools, and we support them with casual relief and contract opportunities. So throughout different conversations, it's really interesting to get insight from principal class staff about what they're looking for with key selection criteria responses. Because of course, when you're applying for a position, especially one that's metropolitan Melbourne, especially in a suburb based, sometimes one position will have hundreds of applicants. So if you're looking at that from the school's perspective, where you've got a panel of staff that are needing to try and work their way through all of these applications, they are looking for ways that the responses can stand out. So they will be looking for particular things. So here are some suggestions. So we've managed to pick from a principal of a Catholic school, principal of a government primary school, and an independent secondary school. So here's a real mixture, and put together their feedback into these dot points. So the one thing that they are looking for is how you approach your relationships. So this is a really human social aspect. So it's not just about what you've learned academically or your content knowledge, it's how you've built relationships in a school community. So focusing on rapport building. Discussion of your passion areas, because of course, in addition to the role that you're applying for, there's an expectation or a hope that you're going to want to engage with the school community in a wider way. So talking about your passion areas can be a great way for a school to understand how else you might be able to contribute to that community. One point which I thought was great that a school mentioned was don't be afraid to discuss times you've been challenged or even made mistakes. We'll talk a little bit later about how you can frame that, but there's a really good opportunity to actually acknowledge mistakes, reflect on those with what you've learned and what you can do in future. Some schools with really high academic standards are actually looking for people to demonstrate how they've impacted the results or success of programs with schools. So that's where the explanation of the example and talking about impact and results is even more important. So looking at address communities, so again, it sort of ties with relationships with the social and emotional side of things. How have you affected the morale, well-being, or even helped with structural improvements at a school so that there's ultimately a greater experience for colleagues, students, and parents? And again, when you're doing research about a school, you might come across a school that you would love to work with, but they might have a program that they run and really prioritize that you haven't had experience with before. So I just picked out PYP, so Primary Years Program. You might have fallen in love with the school that runs the International Baccalaureate, but have no prior experience to that. Don't be afraid of that. Don't use that as a reason not to apply. More so, it's about researching to understand what the program involves, reflect on your experience, and then look at how that experience could actually align with some of the qualities or the structures of the program. And ultimately, schools have said that they want a balance between what's academic, theoretical, structural, so understanding theories, understanding different programs, but also reflecting on the human side of things. They want you to showcase your curriculum knowledge and your content subject knowledge, but also just keeping in touch with your empathy or compassion. You know, there's a reason why we're not robots teaching students. There's still that human aspect that schools are really looking for. So they want to understand you as a person. So just before we move ahead, I've got some question time at the end, but I'm just going to quickly address a question that someone has asked just around, hold on, no, sorry. Going back on that, I will look at it at the end. There's some questions here. I read a question, sorry, and I misunderstood it, but I'll probably answer it as we go through. But keep adding your questions on, guys, and we'll have question time dedicated at the end once we've worked through the majority of the content. So you've had the opportunity to look and find out what the key selection criteria actually are. You've had a bit of a think about how they break down and reflected on your own experience to see how you might want to approach it. But then you're actually getting yourself ready to apply to specific schools. So there's some things to consider before you get started with your writing. Really look at the school websites. A lot of schools are on social media as well. A lot of schools have Facebook pages, Twitter feeds, Instagrams. So a really good space to look to learn as much as you can about the school, their programs and values and things like that. At the moment, I know it's hard to do open nights and tours, but a lot of schools are actually doing virtual tours. So still something to check out. They'll probably put things on social media and their websites about how to engage in that way. So you can still have an opportunity to engage with the school before you apply, if nothing else, to make an informed decision about whether or not it is a school you want to apply to, because a lot of the time with these key selection criteria, because they are standard, it can actually mask a little bit of understanding how is this school different from the next. So going in and actually doing this research not only helps you to do your responses, but it also helps you to learn the school and understand whether or not it's a school that you would like to work with in the first place. Very important. So understanding what are the programs, values, or even targets of that school. So again, a website's a really good place to look at because you'll see probably some documents on there about their strategic plan to have a bit of a look through, again, to understand how your prior experience or knowledge might align with those things. Also, make sure that you research any terms or areas that you don't understand. So if you didn't know what the high impact teaching strategies were, if you didn't know what the department values were first, make sure that you do research it, even just to understand, oh, I don't know what that individual word means, just to make sure that you've got all of that information down. So when you are responding, you're confident that you are giving them the information that they're actually asking for. As I mentioned before, some schools will include that sneaky sixth criterion, so be really mindful of that. There's a specific reason why that's been added to a school. Schools don't have to add a sixth one, so it's likely something that they'll be prioritising, so pay special attention to that. As I mentioned earlier on, especially for graduate teachers, or if you've had prior experience in education that looks a little bit different, this experience is still relevant to draw from. So don't just reflect on your placement experience or your classroom experience up till this point. You can also think about alternative experience you've had and draw from that. So if you've done tutoring, sports coaching, any training or management, you might have taught overseas, you might have led camps, worked in OSH, been a teaching assistant, you might have a lot of industry experience prior to becoming a teacher, or you might have even had curriculum and policy writing experience. So all of those things can be drawn upon in your answers for sure. But do make sure that you try and focus on like classroom ultimately focus. Don't spend the whole time talking about the camps that you run. Just make sure that you've got a balance. Try and look at probably 80% to 20%, loading it in that way. So you can definitely, as a pre-service teacher, draw from your rounds or even what you looked at for assignments that you've done or different sort of topics that you've studied that you think would be relevant and sort of what you took away from those things, how you implemented them even in your placements. It's great to sort of link the two together, the theoretical and the practical, I mean. But then just something to consider, especially for experienced teachers, do try to keep your examples within the last 5 years. I'm sure everyone can agree that education is always evolving and things are always changing. Even some of our acronyms and the ways you refer to different things are changing. So try to keep your examples where possible within the last 5 years of your experience. So to get the writing going, I've already had a couple of questions about why do you, so how long do you make the responses? Of course, with all the things we've already covered, it's like, oh my gosh, there's so much to talk about. Well, to a degree, the general rule is that you try and keep using your normal margins, size 12 font, obviously make things clear, easy to read, don't bunch everything together too much because if nothing else, that poor application panel will go, oh, before reading your response. But a good thing to aim for is 1 page per criterion. So ultimately you're submitting a document that's 5 pages long or 6 if you've got your 6th criterion added. So that's a good thing to aim for. I'm not saying it's a strict rule, but there is definitely such a thing as under-explaining, which we'll get to in a second, which could actually have a negative impact on your application. So just something to keep in mind. To get the writing going, as I've already said, a good starting point is just to break down those different sections of the criterion, understand what it's actually asking about, and also making decisions about what particular parts of it you're going to respond to in your 1-page response. But a good way to get it going can actually just be through having a read of that buzzword that you might have picked out from the criterion and then just doing some stream of consciousness writing. So that's literally just writing nonstop, whether you're typing or handwriting, just empty your head of all the ideas you've had or whatever comes to mind in your experience when you look at that word or look at that criterion. Don't stop to refine it. It's best to just get it all out of your head because you can always edit from there. Some people find it helpful to start with dot pointing instead. So you've got loads of different examples and then you can pick and choose and expand. Or even I've shown an example on the right-hand side. You might have ideas, trees and diagrams, just however it works to get things started. So I had someone who picked out interpersonal skills and they made a bit of a tree looking at interpersonal skills in relation to working with parents, interpersonal skills with my students, and then even branches off from that. So student welfare, student assessment results. So that's a really good way of sort of teasing out some more specific examples from a more general term or general statement.